Hello, I'm Tom Wilkinson, and welcome to the Thinking in English podcast, a podcast for intermediate to advanced level English learners. Earlier this month, employees at an Amazon warehouse in New York formed the company's first official trade union in the United States. This news hit headlines around the world, with activists, journalists, and business leaders all describing it as a significant event. But why? What is a trade union? What do unions do? Why did Amazon employees decide to form a union? And why did Amazon try so hard to stop them? Let's talk about it on today's episode of Thinking in English. Head over to the blog, thinkinginenglish.blog, for a full transcript of today's episode. And why not check out my Instagram page, Thinking in English Podcast, for more great content. Here is today's vocabulary list. As always, the written list is available in the description of the podcast and also on my blog, thinkinginenglish.blog. Private sector. Private sector. Businesses and industries that are not owned or controlled by the government. For example, 60% of recent graduates are employed in the private sector. Public sector. Public sector. Businesses and industries that are owned or controlled by the government. For example, most doctors work in the public sector. To unionize. To unionize. To organize workers to become members of a trade union. For instance, they are about to try and unionize workers at a major supermarket. Interest. Interest. Something that brings advantages to or affects someone or something. As in, a union looks after the interests of its members. Working conditions. Working conditions. The environment in which someone works, including cleanliness, equipment, breaks, overtime pay, etc. For example, that company is infamous for terrible working conditions. On behalf of. On behalf of. In the interests of someone or as a representative of someone or something. For example, I attended a meeting on behalf of my friend. Negotiate. Negotiate. To have formal discussions with someone in order to reach an agreement with them. For example, I managed to negotiate a pay increase with my boss. Profit margin. Profit margin. The difference between the total cost of making and selling something and the price it is sold for. As in, many small companies operate on a narrow profit margin. Contagious. Contagious. If something is contagious, it spreads quickly among people. As in, fear is contagious. What is a trade union? In a nutshell, a trade or labor union is an organization made up of members, and these members are mainly workers. While unions usually have a few different purposes or aims, the main goal of a trade union is to protect the interests of its members in the workplace or industry. In fact, not only do they seek to protect their members' interests, but also to advance or improve their members' situations and working conditions. How does this work in practice? What do trade unions actually do? Well, let me tell you a few ways that unions aim to protect and advance the interests of their members. A union might negotiate with employers over issues like pay or conditions. They can discuss major changes to the workplace and workers' concerns on the behalf of their members. Unions can also help their members with legal and financial advice, as well as send representatives to join members in meetings with their employer. Some trade unions also provide limited amounts of education and other benefits. The purpose of all of these actions is to make sure that the members of the trade union are not exploited and are always treated fairly. Perhaps the most important concept to understand when discussing trade unions is collective bargaining. You might be thinking, why does a union need to represent their members and negotiate on their behalf? Why don't individuals just go to the company and ask for a raise or ask for other benefits by themselves? I guess one way to understand collective bargaining is through the old saying, there is power in numbers. Collective bargaining is when a union will negotiate employment terms on behalf of their members. It is a process that takes place between the management of a company and the labor or trade union. And it is also considered a fundamental right for all workers in all countries. This is considered by the International Labour Organization, a human rights, one of the United Nations human rights bodies. The aim of collective bargaining is to reach an agreement that will establish employment rules for a set amount of time. And if the two sides cannot agree with each other, union members may go on strike. By using collective bargaining, workers are able to have a larger voice and more power than if they were just negotiating by themselves. While a company can usually ignore the voice of one or two employees, there is no way that they can ignore the voices of a much larger number. The terms trade unionism and labor movement are interchangeable and refer to the movement of organized workers. Although smaller workers' associations could be found in 18th century England, the first real trade unions developed in Great Britain, Europe, and the US in the 19th century. At first, unions and their leaders were regularly prosecuted, persecuted, and arrested as they were seen as an obstacle to industry and growth. While unions in both the UK and US encountered similar obstacles, they became quite different in their approaches. UK unions focused on political activism, which eventually developed into the founding of the Labour Party, one of the UK's major political parties, even today. On the other hand, US unions instead focused on collective bargaining to get better salaries and things like that. Over time, unions became recognized by law in much of Europe and North America. The UK Trade Union Act of 1871 gave legal standing to British unions, while the US slowly followed years later. The small craft unions that emerged at the beginning of the labor movement, usually representing skilled craftsmen, eventually were overtaken by larger mass industrial unions. Especially in the UK and in parts of Europe, industrial unions can represent a large number of unskilled or semi skilled workers and have become very powerful negotiators. Although unions were formed early on in the United States, American trade unionism is very different and much less significant than that of Europe. The United States has implemented a series of laws known as the Right to Work laws. And one of the consequences of said law was that workers could not be required or forced to join a union. In effect, this weakened collective bargaining and reduced the amount of money available for unions to spend on legal or political activities. Other laws in certain US states have limited or even prohibited collective bargaining, and made it illegal for public sector unions to organize strikes. Overall, US union membership is far lower than in many other developed countries. Currently, only around 11% of American workers are members of a union, and states vary widely in the amount of union members they have, from 24% of workers in Hawaii being in a union to just 3% of workers in South Carolina. And the figures are even lower for private sector workers. Currently, only 6% in the entire country are unionized. Comparing the US with other OECD member countries reveals how low US union membership actually is. Over 50% of Belgian workers are members of a union, almost 35% in Italy, and 25% in the US's neighbor Canada. In Iceland, over 90% of the country's workforce is unionized. Now you understand the context and history of trade unionism. Let's think about why the workers in the Amazon warehouse decided to form their own union. And also, why did Amazon try so hard to stop them succeeding? First, it's important to know that the Staten Island warehouse workers in New York were not the first Amazon employees to try to form a union. Last year, there was a very publicized effort to form a union in Alabama, but it failed overwhelmingly. In both Alabama and New York, Amazon invested a lot of time, money, and resources in trying to prevent the formation of that union. According to Amazon, having a direct relationship with the company is best for our employees. All Amazon employees were forced to attend anti union company meetings, and Amazon management placed posters and leaflets all around the warehouse, encouraging workers to vote against the union. Across the entire US, Amazon actually spent $4 million just on consultants who would go to warehouses and talk to employees about why unions were not a good idea. So, why did the employees choose to form a union in the first place? Well, you might know, but Amazon has been highly criticized over working conditions for warehouse employees and drivers in recent years. Let's think about it this way. Have you ever ordered anything from Amazon? Because I have all the time. Yesterday at 8 a.m., I ordered a COVID-19 test and a few board games on Amazon for a trip I'm taking at the weekend. After going to central Tokyo for some meetings and a Japanese class, I returned home at 6 p.m., and my order was already delivered. It took less than 12 hours for my three items to be processed, found, and packaged in the warehouse, then dispatched and delivered to my address. In order to achieve this incredible speed of delivery, Amazon has very strict and tough working conditions. Workers regularly complain about too few bathroom breaks, which are actually timed to make sure that you don't take too long in the bathroom. They complain about difficult work goals and also unsafe conditions. The New York workers complained about similar issues, in particular, the pain caused by long hours of constantly walking and standing. This seems to have caused a lot of frustration among employees. The Amazon warehouse workers hope that by forming a union, they will be able to negotiate better working conditions and benefits with Amazon. As other unions have done throughout history, the idea is that through the process of collective bargaining, employees can put their voices together and be more powerful. As I already mentioned, Amazon tried incredibly hard to prevent the formation of this union. Amazon operates at a very tight profit margin and with a very fast and flexible business model. and the management of the company believes that a union would start to slow down the company and cost more money. Some analysts have also pointed out that Amazon rarely gives salary raises to employees and instead actually encourages people to quit instead of paying them a higher wage. A union would make this more difficult, as the union would tell their employees not to quit and instead negotiate for a higher salary. Of course, Amazon does not tell employees all of this information when talking about unions. Instead, a spokesperson for the company stated their position. They said Amazon already offers what unions are requesting for employees: industry leading pay, comprehensive benefits from the first day on the job, opportunities for career growth, all while working in a safe, modern, and inclusive work environment. At Amazon, these benefits and opportunities come with the job, as does the ability to communicate directly with the leadership of the company. To what extent this is true, I'm not sure, but for the workers in Staten Island, they obviously didn't think this was enough. But does any of this matter? A union in a single warehouse is not necessarily that significant. So, why did Amazon try so hard to prevent its formation? Does it actually matter? Amazon fears a much wider adoption of unions in its facilities. While one union probably won't slow the business down, 100 might. Throughout the US, approval of labor unions has actually increased a lot in recent years, and President Joe Biden has tried to position himself as the most pro union president in US history. Unions are also contagious. When one union forms, other employees notice. Other workers can be encouraged and guided by a successful unionization effort. For example, the first Starbucks cafe union formed in December last year, and since then, 8 other Starbucks cafes have also unionized. Amazon is worried the same thing will happen. Another warehouse in New York will vote on forming a union this month, and one of America's largest unions, called the Teamsters, has announced that they will try to include Amazon drivers and delivery workers in their union. So here is today's final thought. On this episode of Thinking in English, I have tried to introduce the idea of trade unions, talked about why Amazon employees formed the first union in the company's history, and explained some useful union based vocabulary. Hopefully, after listening to this episode, you have both learned something about labor movements, learned a few new words, and maybe practiced listening as well. If you ever plan to work or live in an English speaking country, learning a little about unions could be very useful in your future. Are you currently a member of a trade union? How does your country treat unions and their members? Do you support unions, or do you think they get in the way of company efficiency? Let me know in the comments on the blog, the comments on Spotify, or reach out on Instagram and tell me your thoughts. I love to hear from people, and I get so many lovely messages and amazing comments. So, yeah, please leave a few comments, and thank you.